All right. Hello, historians. We are going to discuss the last part of phase two of the Cold War. We've discussed Harry Truman's years and how Harry Truman dealt with the Cold War, the Truman Doctrine, stopping the spread of communism, containment, those types of things. We discussed the Eisenhower years of the 1950s and some of the major events that occurred. The end of the Korean War, the start of the space race, the start of the arms race, those types of things. And now we're going to get into the Kennedy years, which is the early 1960s, and we're going to, this will kind of finish up phase two of the Cold War. This is a guy that I think most of you recognize when you see him. One of the reasons for that, or there's probably multiple reasons, but one of them that he was assassinated, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Kennedy assassination. All right. So in 1960, during that presidential race, John F. Kennedy was debating, or his rival, his opponent, was Richard Nixon, and Nixon will eventually become president, but he will lose out to Kennedy, and um, Nixon had been the vice president for Eisenhower. So a lot of times you see whoever the vice president was, they run for president in the next election. The interesting thing about this election and this campaign was that it was the first this was the first debate to ever be held on TV. Previously, debates were either on the radio, or before that they printed out answers in newspapers, or you actually had to go to them. So this was the first ever debate that American people would tune into on television, and we will have a link later that you see here. But essentially, what happens is Kennedy looked better on TV. One of the things he did is he used makeup. A lot of today, if you go on TV, doesn't matter if you're male or female, they're going to put some type of makeup on you so there's not a glare on you on the TV screen and stuff like that. And so Kennedy used makeup. People watching the debate looked at Kennedy and thought, boy, he looks calm. They looked at Nixon. He was kind of shiny from the cameras. He was sweating a little bit. And then, of course, without any makeup on or anything, that sweat turned into a shine, and people just thought he looked nervous. And so the people that watched on TV, which was most of America, thought that Kennedy won the debates. The people that listened to it on the radio thought that Nixon won the debates. So TV, for the first time, is a game changer in our country's history. So Kennedy goes on to become president. So he follows Dwight D. Eisenhower. Kennedy was a Democrat. So we went from having a long line of Democrats in the 30s with Roosevelt and then Truman, to a Republican with Eisenhower, and then back to a Democrat with Kennedy. What was interesting about Kennedy, he was the youngest president ever elected at 43 years old. If you remember, Theodore Roosevelt had been the youngest president, but that was because McKinley was assassinated and he became president that way at 42 years old, I believe. And then Roosevelt runs again when he's older than 43. The other thing about Kennedy is he was a Catholic, our first Catholic president, and I think maybe our only Catholic president. I'd have to double check on that. But this was kind of controversial. The country was founded, on Protestantism, and you had all Protestant presidents, so non-Catholic Christian presidents, up until this point. And people were worried a little bit about this because they thought, well, what if he's taking orders from the Pope in Rome? And so that was something they worried about a little bit back in the 1960s. Probably not something we worry about today, but definitely something that was on their radar back then. You can see he had a young wife, he had young kids. People began referring to this, to the Kennedys in Washington, D.C. as Camelot. Camelot that term goes back to like King Arthur, in the Knights of the Round Table times, where it's like this peaceful place, paradise type of place. And so everything felt pretty good. Here's the United States. I don't know if you'd say we're winning the Cold War, but things are good. World War II is now over 10 years, 15 years old. It's been over for 15 years. We're building stuff. People have jobs. The baby boom is on. Lots of kids are being born. And it just felt good, and that we're optimistic. Here's this young president. He inspired people. People felt good. And we'll have a reading on that. One of the first signs of trouble, or one of the first things that happens during Kennedy's administration that doesn't look good, is called the Bay of Pigs invasion. And this was actually an idea that started off during Eisenhower's administration. And when Eisenhower didn't have time to go through with it, or maybe he didn't want to go through with it, but either way, the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, was training over 1,500 troops. These troops were former Cubans that had defected, and they were training them in South America to invade Cuba. So these were American-trained soldiers. They weren't Americans, but American-trained soldiers using weapons provided to them by Americans, by our tax dollars, right? So this is all being paid for by our tax dollars. And the idea was we were going to ship them off to Cuba, and they would overthrow Fidel Castro and the communist government that had taken over 10 years earlier. And so basically the CIA presents this plan that they had been working on to Kennedy, and Kennedy says, sure, let's do it. This would be big. So they launch the invasion, and it fails. Many of these troops are captured, many are killed, many are sentenced to death afterwards. And this is really a bad look for the United States, that we failed in this coup. And of course, it makes the Russians look good. It makes Fidel Castro and the communist government of Cuba look good. And it makes the United States look bad. It really embarrasses this young president that had just taken over. The entire world is hearing about this. The entire world is seeing this. And it's not a good look for the United States. And this is shortly after the U-2 incident, when our spy plane crashed over in Russia. And so now we're starting to not look good a little bit here. The next big issue that comes up, and we'll have a video on this later, but the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. This is probably as close as the United States has ever come to a nuclear war, where literally you had people on both sides telling leaders, hey, we need to fire off missiles. It's now or never. We got to hit them before they hit us. And luckily, no missiles were launched. What starts happening is the Soviet Union starts putting missiles in Cuba. And if you look at the range of these intercontinental ballistic missiles and what they can hit places as far away as the West Coast, in California, Seattle, Washington. They can hit Denver. They can hit Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York, Miami. They can hit it all. And so people are worried. What American citizens did not know is we had a bunch of nuclear missiles in the country of Turkey. And so we would have been able to hit pretty much every major city in the Soviet Union. And so basically, we've got missiles pointed at them. They've got missiles pointed at us. We did not want any more missiles going to Cuba. And so we told the Soviet Union, we're going to set up a blockade. We're not going to allow any more missiles and any more ships from the Soviet Union to travel to Cuba. And basically Russia says, or the Soviet Union says, you can't do that. We have every right to trade with them and every right to drop things off. And we sent warships in 1962 down into the Gulf of Mexico, out into the Atlantic Ocean, and basically said, we're going to stop you. And at that point, things got pretty hairy. Like, um, is somebody going to launch a missile? And Americans and Soviets were both very, very scared. And we'll see a video on this. In the end, cooler heads will prevail. Here you can see Nikita Khrushchev, who took over for Stalin, and Fidel Castro, the leader of Cuba. Here's Kennedy and Khrushchev. Famous political cartoon. You got Kennedy and Khrushchev arm wrestling. Notice what their fingers are close to, a button. And that button leads to a bomb with an H on it, hydrogen bomb, much more powerful than the atomic bomb. And so it's like a symbolic arm wrestling, only they're both ready to hit the button to launch nuclear weapons. In the end, and we'll see it on the video later, both sides decide they're going to back down. The Russians take their missiles out of Cuba, and we take our missiles out of Turkey. And so that's about as close as we've ever come to a nuclear war, where you literally had people saying on both sides, maybe we need to launch these missiles. It probably goes down as Kennedy's finest moment, where he did not want to do it. He knew it would be bad news, and saves the world from destruction. Khrushchev, on the other side, same thing. He had, when he took over as premier of the Soviet Union, he told the people that they had been lied to by Stalin. And he said, yeah, Stalin's been telling you we're going to win a World War III against the United States. And he said, if we get into a war against the United States, nuclear missiles will be used and nobody will win. So Khrushchev changed a lot of things in the Soviet Union as well. We've have some readings and videos on that as well. So we've got the Bay of Pigs invasion, which we would consider to be a failure. You've got the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which I guess you'd consider to be a success because the world did not end. Nobody was launching nuclear missiles at each other. We pulled missiles out of Turkey. They pulled missiles out of Cuba. So that would be a success. In 1961, basically under the cover of darkness in a very short amount of time, in Berlin, the East Berlin government put up a wall. And one of the reasons for this is people were like, you know what, we don't like living in East Germany. Let's just walk across the border, because it was just basically a sidewalk, and walk into West Germany and see our friends and never come back to East Germany. And so they decide, you know what, we don't like this. We're going to put up a wall. And of course, this becomes the famous Berlin Wall, completed in 1961. You can see it here. And it wasn't like people in East Germany could just walk up to the wall. Here's West Germany. You can just walk right up there. They had guards all the time. People tried to escape. Some of them would try to tunnel underneath. Some might try to jump out of a window if they were close enough to the wall. Others might try to run with a ladder. Many people were captured. Many people were killed trying to escape. Some did make it, but many did not. You can see the guard towers, probably West Germany here, kid looking out. On the western side, people painted the wall, graffiti on it. They were free to do what they want in West Germany, right? Democracy. And so a very famous quote that John F. Kennedy had, he gave a speech in 1963 in West Berlin. This is only a few months before he's assassinated. But he gives a speech in West Berlin where he says, Ich bin ein Berliner, which means I am a person of Berlin, or I am a Berlin person, or Berliner. And I guess like they always say, like one of the translations says it means I am a donut, but everybody knew what he meant, and basically says, hey, the world is with you. The democracies of the world are with you, and we support you. So a very famous quote, very famous speech. And then just a few months later, Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, Texas, by Lee Harvey Oswald. He's riding, basically kind of gets off the plane. He's riding through Dallas in a convertible. and Lee Harvey Oswald is stationed up in the Dallas book depository there, and takes a shot with a rifle and hits Kennedy and kills him. And this was the last time presidents rode in a convertible. Now, if you see what the presidents ride in in their limos, those limos are tanks. Here's Lee Harvey Oswald. I think he was a former, I guess I'm not 100% sure if he's a former Marine, but he had been in the military. And the conspiracy theorists will always point out when he was in the military, people that knew him said he was a bad shot. So a lot of conspiracy theories popped up. To make matters worse, they never really got a chance to interview him because he's going to be assassinated shortly after this. Whoop, make that smaller. The Warren Commission was put together, and it was the information that they came up with in the investigation. They concluded that Oswald had acted alone, and that Jack Ruby had acted alone in killing Oswald. So you can see, here's the picture. Jack Ruby, a guy that had some ties to the Mafia, he walked up as they were transporting Oswald from one jail to the next, walked up and shot him and killed him. Shortly after this, Jack Ruby dies of cancer. And so conspiracy theorists will talk about this as well. Now, there's actual footage of what happens to Kennedy with the assassination. You know, you think about today, everybody would have their phone out and be videotaping it. Even going back 20 years, the news stations would be all over the place videotaping everything. However, back in these days, there was limited video footage, and just so happened, a guy by the name of Abraham Zapruder was filming Kennedy as he came around in the motorcade, and he's filming it as the assassination takes place. And I think maybe we were able to watch this just without sound. Abraham Zapruder film. He sold it, and their family eventually got it back. Who becomes president after this? Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, and he will eventually win another term. And if you look at the map, some of the famous places that they talk about in the conspiracies, you have the grassy knoll located here, or right here, I should say. Zapruder standing here, taking the film. Here comes President's limo. Here's the Texas School Book Depository where Oswald was sitting and took the shot. Here's the grassy knoll that they talk about, where possibly there was a second shooter. People will always talk about the second shooter standing on the grassy knoll. A lot of times they'll say the bullet didn't line up. How could it go through Kennedy at a different angle like this? There had to be a second shooter. There had to be a cover-up. Who's responsible for this? A lot of people don't buy that Oswald acted alone. So some different conspiracies is that there was a second shooter on the grassy knoll, or more than one shooter. The magic bullet theory, which this is to say, hey, this Oswald couldn't have shot him with just one bullet, the way it entered and exited. Who's responsible? Some people said the Mafia, organized mob in the country. Kennedy and his brother, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, were cracking down on organized crime. People didn't like it. Some people said the CIA was responsible, that they wanted Kennedy out of there. Some people said Fidel Castro. We had tried to assassinate Castro multiple times. Once even with the CIA tried to get him with a cigar that it was supposed to explode. And so if we're trying to assassinate him, maybe he's trying to assassinate our president. Some people thought LBJ wanted to become president. Some people said his wife might have organized it because there was stories that Kennedy may have been having affairs with people, like Marilyn Monroe, famous actress. The KGB, which is the Soviet version of the CIA, may have done it. So there's lots of theories out there. You can search the internet for all these theories. There really isn't a ton of actual proof of any of this, but um, as far as history goes, Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Here's the KGB. This is the main security agency for the Soviet Union. They were started in 1954 until in the early 90s when they broke up. Vladimir Putin, the current leader of the Soviet Union, or of Russia, who is really a dictator. He's been in charge of Russia for a long time now, over 20 years. He's a former KGB agent, intelligence agent. He was a guy that interrogated people, got information out of them. So, a very smart guy. And this is the Kremlin. This is like their Capitol building. This is where all of their decisions are made in their government. Lots of movies out there about the CIA and KGB. They were real. They were spying on each other. They had spies. We had spies in Russia. They had spies in the United States. And then after Kennedy is killed in early 1964, the world is shocked again as a third country gets the atomic bomb, and that is China. So in 1964, China becomes the third country with an atomic bomb, and of course the United States is sitting here going, uh-oh, there are two communist countries with the bomb and only one country, only one democracy with it. Eventually, countries like France and Great Britain will also get the atomic bomb. And so that kind of concludes the Kennedy years.